Well, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. It's really exciting to be out of the country for the first time in a while, so thank you very much. Okay, so everyone wants to have beautiful sports fields, including athletic fields, but also golf courses. And this picture is actually taken from the time that we hosted the International Turfgrass Conference 6 years ago in New Jersey, though, so that's from Red Bull Stadium. To have these high-quality sports fields or golf courses, we need the high-quality grasses that we use on those areas. These typically, for us, in the northern part of the United States, are blends of Poa pratensis, and we also are going to use a lot of Lolium perenne on our courses because of quick establishment and wear tolerance. We're getting a lot more areas using turf-type tall fescue, and I'm going to come back to that later because turf-type tall fescue can actually be used for both higher maintenance and lower maintenance. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. On golf courses for our region, creeping bentgrass is probably the most popular for these higher quality areas. They are going to tolerate your lowest cutting heights and also have that stoloniferous growth habit for recovery from divots and other ball marks and other types of stresses. So it's the most popular. But with that comes the requirement for more significant fertility, more significant irrigation, frequent pesticide applications, as well as mowing. And then with that additional management comes other inputs that you have to add to manage thatch that can develop. So it ends up kind of being a vicious circle of increasing all of your management inputs to have this, beautiful, highly manicured area. But can we have some more sustainable options? And that's kind of what I want to talk to you about today. There's a lot of research that we've been doing. I've been doing this for a long time, looking at low maintenance. And so what we want to try to do is find grasses that can tolerate less frequent mowing, less watering. In fact, most of the trials I do not irrigate them. And then also less pesticide applications and less fertility. With our golf course areas, though, we do irrigate them. But on our landscape turf that we're using for potentially athletic fields, we would not irrigate them. With managing some of these grasses under low maintenance, we can see a slight lighter color in the grass. If you're going to not fertilize as much, the color is going to be a little bit lighter. It can actually sometimes go dormant, and so it can turn brown. That's if you don't water at all. Usually what we find, though, is that some of the diseases are less prevalent. So things like brown patch caused by Rhizoctonia solani or Pythium diseases, you don't see them as frequently as you would in a highly irrigated and highly fertilized area. But I do see some diseases more prevalent, which are ones that are associated with lower fertility, things like dollar spot, red thread, and stem rust. So those tend to be more prevalent, and then the other ones are less frequent. Stem rust is something that we see typically on Poa pratensis, especially during establishment under low fertility. So choosing the right grass for this is important. But we do have some alternative species. So remember I said that sometimes your grass can be a little bit lighter green, and you can see here this whole trial is a low maintenance trial compared to one that's highly managed right there, so it's a slightly lighter color. However, I want to be able to have, I don't want to have that reduction in lighter color. We want the grass to still maintain a green color even into drought periods, and we want them to maintain that green color with less fertility. So that's my goal in breeding. So that's what we've been working on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the alternative species that we were using. And some of you, especially here in Denmark and in Scandinavia, are probably already using some of these grasses. But in the northern part of the United States, they're less popular. So this one is colonial bentgrass, or Grassus capillaris. There's a lot of positives to this species. It's much more tolerant to dollar spot than creeping bentgrass, which you can see here right up to the line. Disease versus no disease. This is without any fungicides. It's got increased drought tolerance, lower nitrogen requirement, and less thatch accumulation. And we also have done wear tolerance trials under fairway conditions, and colonial bentgrass for us, under those lower maintenance, has improved wear tolerance over creeping bentgrass. Some of the negatives, though, it is more susceptible to Rhizoctonia solani compared to creeping bentgrass, and you can see these are some of the large patches we can see on colonial bentgrass. However, we have been breeding for improved tolerance, and we have cultivars available now that don't have as much brown patch disease. I know you don't have the same names of these grasses as we have in the United States, but Puritan and Heritage are two cultivars that have improved tolerance. They're not quite ready for a putting green yet, although you guys might mow your putting greens a little bit higher than you would if you would have a higher maintenance course. But I'm working on that. I think we can get there for having colonial bentgrass on a putting green. But it's a bunch type grass, and so the divot recovery is a question. And so that's something that we wanted to look at. Chewings fescue is another one, Festuca rubra comitata. Of the fine fescues, this has the lowest cutting height tolerance. Also has, with the other fine fescues, good performance with low fertility, and it mixes well with colonial bentgrass, actually. So that's something else we wanted to look at. Some of the negatives for us are it's very susceptible to a bipolaris leaf spot, which over the last 3 years has been pretty devastating to our fine fescues. So I don't know if that's something in the future that we'll have to consider more, but the Chewings fescue is quite susceptible to that. And then the question with a lot of these alternatives, they're not stoloniferous, so they're a bunch type, and they potentially would not recover as quickly from divot injury. Another species, which is one of my favorites, but hard to get people to think about and use, and that's Agrostis canina, or velvet bentgrass. It's got very high shoot density, good tolerance to both dollar spot and brown patch, and it has increased drought tolerance, heat tolerance, wear tolerance. So you think it's this great grass, but we can't really get too many people utilizing this species, but it's pretty interesting. So here's velvet bentgrass compared to creeping bentgrass, and you can see this is a really high density grass. So some of the negatives are seed production. We've actually been working with our cooperators in the seed industry to try to produce this species, but we're having some trouble, and that's one of the reasons why you can't get very many varieties of this species. It's susceptible also to a disease called copper spot, which you may not have here. It's usually only with really high temperatures that you see this. Hopefully it's not something that could potentially be coming. Like I've just learned that dollar spot became very prevalent in Norway and in Scandinavia. So hopefully you won't get this. But then we also find velvet bentgrass can be susceptible to snow mold as well. But what we have seen in some of the trials that we've done in Quebec is that higher quality velvet bentgrasses also have improved microdochium tolerance. So there is a positive correlation there, so that's good. You do have the potential for thatch development of this species, so definitely maintaining other lower nitrogen fertility will reduce your thatch production. And again, as we've said with the other ones, it's a bunch type grass, so you don't get divot recovery potential as well. I'm going to skip over hard fescue, but we have looked at hard fescue as a low maintenance fairway grass also. So we've done some mixtures with that. So one of the, it's susceptible to summer patches, is hard fescue's biggest problem. But some of the ways we've looked at these species is to put them in mixtures. So we've mixed all possible combinations of these species together, and we found that under low maintenance fairway conditions, we find that these mixes actually have better turf quality and better wear tolerance and also improved disease resistance over each species by itself. And that's something that we don't typically see with other mixes that we do. Is usually something in the middle between each of the two species. We don't see that synergistic effect, but in this case we do. So I've found that the research that we've been doing on these mixtures has been very interesting because we have been able to make the quality better with mixing it together. So we first started doing this work back in, around 10 or 12 years ago, looking at these alternative species for low maintenance fairway. So we've got the different cultivars of each species mentioned there. And we had mixtures. So we put in, have we go back here? We put in colonial bentgrass mixed with a bunch of different fine fescues. We even had a fine fescue mix only, and then some different bentgrass species mixed together. We mowed that at 1.25 centimeters. We only had a curative fungicide. We irrigated at 50% ET, and the fertility was less than 97 kilograms per hectare per year. And we applied wear with a golf cart. And we found that the quality of those mixes, like I mentioned before, was better than it was with the individual species. So here's Capri by itself. That's a colonial bentgrass. Turf quality, 9 is the highest, 1 is the lowest. And these are the top 20 entries in the trial. And you can see the mixes make up the majority of the higher quality grasses there. So we have Capri and Rushmore, but the mix together is better than both of the individual species. For wear tolerance, we saw similar things. So these are the highest quality mixes and grasses that we had for wear tolerance. And so you can see the majority of the top performers are all mixes, except for velvet bentgrass, which does quite well actually. And then as we look at the ones at the bottom of the trial, or the ones that were the worst for wear tolerance, it's these other species that we kind of wanted to see what would happen, but tall fescue and Kentucky bluegrass are not good choices for low maintenance, which we knew. We just kind of wanted to see what would happen. So the takeaways from that initial research was that the mixtures were actually better than each of the individual species by themselves. And the best mixes were the colonial and chewings fescue, colonial velvet, and colonial and hard fescue mixes. So we set up another study to look at divot recovery. And so we cut out those species that weren't as good and looked more at the mixes that were good and increased the number of cultivars that we were looking at for each one. So here we have colonial bentgrass mixed with some fine fescues. We also had slender creeping red fescue and hard fescue in there as well, and 3 different colonial bentgrasses that we were looking at. And then we also included some mixes with velvet bentgrass too. So velvet mixed with other colonial bentgrass, and then velvet mixed with the fine fescues as well. And here you can see this would be creeping bentgrass by itself getting some dollar spot, and a mix right next to it that has nothing. And then this would be colonial bentgrass right here that does not have any dollar spot either. And again, what we saw similar to the other trial was that the mixtures for turf quality, and for disease resistance also, I don't have that data to show you because I didn't have time, but the majority of the highest performers in that trial were mixes. We do have Puritan here by itself that did quite well, but these are the top 20 entries in the trial, again, almost all mixtures. And then when we look at the worst performers in that, you can see most of them, if we go back, most of them are the individual monostands of each of the species. And creeping bentgrass, which is right here. We have the other creeping bentgrasses that we put in there that have dollar spot resistance, but they still were not as good as the mixtures. So that was really interesting to us. So we applied divots with a divot machine. We made these in 2017 and 2018 and looked at divot recovery from those mixes. So I'm just pulling out a little bit of the data because I have not much time left here. So we looked at Capri, colonial bentgrass, Pencross, creeping bentgrass, and this is days after injury. So 35 days, 112 days after injury, and the percent green cover at each of those dates. So we see, we can't argue that Pencross isn't good. It is good in terms of its ability to recover from a divot injury, and we knew that that was the case. But what we wanted to see was, are there some of these mixtures that could be comparable to Pencross? And we did find some, surprisingly, that were, you know, they did recover from the divot injury. Some are not as good, but, you know, we did find some mixes, depending on the particular cultivar that you mix together, they're almost as good as Pencross in terms of its divot recovery. So here's just a picture. This is colonial bentgrass, this is creeping bentgrass, and then the mix of the two together. Not that much difference. We also did, looking at a different cultivar, this would be Puritan, and then so we had Puritan with hard fescue, Chewing's fescue, and then this is slender creeping red fescue. And again, days after injury, and we looked at the percent green cover. So, you know, there's some that are comparable to where the mixture is just as good as the individual species. And then here's some pictures of that, of the divot injury and the recovery. Under this lower maintenance, you saw it took 112 days. It takes a long time because we don't put on a lot of fertility on these trials, so it can take a long time to recover. But we wanted to really see what would happen under those lower fertility cases. So takeaways from this trial are that Pencross, we can't argue, it does have good divot recovery. It doesn't have good dollar spot resistance or other things, but it does have good divot recovery. The mixtures, although variable, were also not worse necessarily than the monostand of each of the individual species. And then that combined, when you combine that and you consider turf quality and you consider disease resistance, those mixtures are better than the straight individual species. I think I might have to stop there. I just wanted to let you know that we have tall fescue, which is also quite good for low maintenance sports turf. I would not use that for a golf course fairway, but for sports turf, tall fescue, and I'll skip through this a little bit, just to show you that we've been trying to improve brown patch resistance, which is the biggest problem in tall fescue, by selecting individual clones with good brown patch resistance and intercrossing them, and we have very high dense varieties that don't have brown patch susceptibility. We've been trying to look at wear tolerance in tall fescue because that's one of the negatives, and we've made improvements in that. And then the last thing, we've been selecting for drought tolerance as well, but the last thing I wanted to just point out is Kentucky bluegrass. There are varieties of Poa pratensis under low maintenance that can have excellent wear tolerance and excellent turf quality, especially under drought stress. Some of these, we've looked at rooting under high temperature stress, and depending on the variety, you can have varieties that really can have very high rooting potential. But some of the low maintenance Kentucky bluegrass varieties, you can't, every variety is not the same for Kentucky bluegrass. You can't have, you know, midnight Kentucky bluegrass be good. That's a good one for higher quality or higher maintenance athletic fields, but that's not one you would want to use under low maintenance. It's actually not that good. You would want to go with something within this group. And again, those names are not the same for you here in Europe, but we could work with your seed company cooperators to get the right varieties for you. But we do have varieties of tall fescue and Kentucky bluegrass that you can both use individually and also mix together to create a very high quality sports turf as well. So I didn't have much time to talk about the sports turf research, but just I'll leave it with just the finals with that. Final statements for that are that, you know, tall fescue and Kentucky bluegrass, depending on the variety, can also be quite good. And with that, I'll end. I rushed through some of the stuff at the end, but just wanted to try to cover a little bit of everything. So thank you very much.